Well, hey everyone, this is Arthur from Trusting the God of the Gospel, and today I want to talk about trust. It's a huge word when we're thinking about how we can best disciple adopted and foster teenagers. Trust is a big part of that. Our teenagers must learn to trust both God and people in light of their past experiences. And I would say this, in order for them to begin trusting people, maybe they should first begin to trust God. I think there's a good kind of progression there, or correlation there, that in order to trust people, let's get you to a point where you can trust God. And so for you as parents who have adopted and foster teenagers, I have 3 questions that we can ask our teenagers to prompt a discussion about how they can better trust God. And here's question number 1. What if you could find your happiness in God? What if you could find your happiness in God? When I was a kid, there was an old Sunday school song that we used to sing called Trust and Obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey. And I think there's a fundamental principle there that maybe we miss sometimes, or at least I missed when I was a 5-year-old singing that song. Trust leads to happiness. Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus. Do you really want to be happy in Jesus? Do you want to have the joy of the Lord? Well, learn to trust him first. And so I would say trust leads to happiness, but on the flip side of that, I would also say lack of trust leads to lack of happiness. And so if we have adopted and foster teenagers who right now are not capable of trusting God, I would probably also argue that they're not capable of experiencing the joy of the Lord, that happiness in Jesus that we sung about when we were kids. If they're not trusting him, they're not finding their happiness in him. So we ask ourselves the question, or we ask them the question, what if you could find your happiness in God? In order to do that, you would need to first trust God. And they might say, well, I can't trust God. In light of where I've been, in light of the things I've gone through, I can't trust God. Where was he when I was going through X, Y, and Z? And that is a fair question. Even as adults, we wrestle with that. Where was God when I was going through whatever it was? And so we still ask the question, though. Here's question number 2. What if you could place your trust in God? Like, I understand you're at a point where you're just not able to trust God because of what you've been through, and you don't feel like he was there for you when you were going through this hardship. I get that. But hypothetically, theoretically, what if you could place your trust in God? What would have to be true in order for you to trust your God? And maybe even have your teenager write those things down. Here's the scenario that if this was true, then yes, I could trust God. And start having a conversation about, like, all right, so how do we kind of make that scenario happen? I understand you can't trust God right now, and we get that. But what if you could? What would have to be true in order for you to trust God? And you start looking at what they've written down and seeing, is there a way that we can start creating that scenario that they've written down so that they are on track to eventually begin to trust God? And here's a way that I would also say that we can lead to our teenagers trusting God. And that brings us to question number 3. What if you could grow in your knowledge of God? What if you could grow in your knowledge of God? Psalm chapter 9, verse 10 says this: those who know your name trust in you. Those who know your name trust in you. There is a connection between trusting and knowing. If you know God, you learn to trust God. In order to trust God, know God. So how do we get to know God? Well, we spend time with God. Like in any other relationship, we spend time building that relationship. We spend time getting to know God, because as we get to know God, when we get to a point where we're starting to really feel like we're connecting with God, we understand God, we know him, boom, suddenly we are trusting God. And as we trust God, then suddenly, boom, once again, we're finding our happiness in God. In order to trust people, then, we need to first trust God. In order to trust God, we need to know God. And then when all of that is kind of clicking, we're finding our happiness in God. So our 3 questions: what if you could find your happiness in God? What if you could place your trust in God? And what if you could grow in your knowledge of God? And as you're able to work on those 3 things and kind of progress from knowing God to trusting God to finding your happiness in God, you're going to find that that's going to overflow into trusting relationships with people as well. Guys, thanks so much for listening. This has been Trusting the God of the Gospel. Bye-bye.
Today's episode was brought to you by the Trusting the God of the Gospel video series. For more information on this powerful discipleship resource for adopted and foster teenagers, visit trustingthegodofthegospel.com/shop.